Well, welcome everybody. Welcome to another Center for Cybercrime Studies lecture. I'm Doug Slane, Director of the Center. And this is our first lecture of this academic year. And I'm very happy today that, well, before I do introduce our speaker, just let me ask that I'll be passing around these sign-in sheets. I just appreciate put your name and your email address on it. And if you're not on the distribution list, I'll be happy to put you on the distribution list for future talks. And I'm hoping we have a number of talks this academic year. Today we're very happy to have with us Tom Holt, who's a professor in the School of Criminal Justice at Michigan State University. Tom is interested in various aspects of cybercrime. But I think you're going to find today's talk particularly interesting because Tom and his students actually go out there on the internet and go into many of these websites where this digital contraband is for sale. In other words, all those credit card numbers that get picked up when you hear about one of these big data breaches. Most recent big one, of course, being Home Depot, and various other types of digital contraband. Sold on these sites. So Tom has a lot of insight into that, and so we're really looking forward to hearing this talk. So without further ado, Tom Holt.
Thank you, everyone. I appreciate it. It's always nice to be here. This is always a fun place to talk about some of the research that we're doing. As Dr. Slane mentioned, the sheer number of breaches is staggering. How many of you think you might have lost data in the Home Depot or Target breaches? How many of you have had a card reissued this year? Many of you have had more than one card reissued this year. Good, I'm glad I'm not alone. I have had all of my cards reissued at some point in the last 12 months. And it's getting to a point where I actually saw an article published last week raising this idea of breach fatigue, where there is so much information in the news about data breaches that eventually it's possible that consumers are just going to be tired of hearing about breaches and therefore not care. And if that actually happens, we're in for a very serious set of circumstances and problems. Consumers really are the first line of identification in some cases for breaches. And so we need to begin to understand the way in which data thieves operate, the way that the customers of thieves operate, and then in turn, how do the markets themselves operate. We have to think more like an offender in order to understand the process of data breach from end to end, rather than necessarily thinking about it perhaps from an IT perspective. Certainly, we need to understand what are the vulnerabilities, what are the points of weakness within point-of-sale terminals or online portals or whatever. But we also need to understand who's doing what with information. In a sense, we might treat the idea of data being stolen in the same way that we might treat someone stealing a laptop or a video game system or a TV or jewelry. Offenders in the real world typically are going to take that which is portable, easily concealed, and generates some degree of overall market value. If a laptop, for instance, costs a few $100s, you might expect to get maybe $200 or $300 or less, depending, when you try to pawn it. And there's a marketplace for stolen resources in the real world. Well, certainly we're seeing the same thing in a virtual space. And so what I'll talk about today is the way in which these markets work, but we'll take it from the standpoint of the actual offender population. So who are the vendors, who are the buyers, and then how do they interact with one another? Before I go any further, let me just say that this research was actually supported by the National Institute of Justice for a research award looking at international organized crime. Part of our emphasis in this study was to look at social networks, how individuals come together, what their relationships are like, how long they last, and then at what point do they break up, or how do those relationships evolve over time. So what I'll go into today is sort of the first pass of some of the research and publications that we're getting into now. If you're not familiar, though we've heard a ton about data breaches in the last couple of years in particular, the research literature in this space is variable. There's some research coming from information security, from computer science, and there's a very small proportion that's coming from criminal justice or from the social sciences. Certainly, most of the research that's out there looks at what are referred to as forums. If you're not familiar, a forum is a web-based platform where you can go in and it's asynchronous. You create a post, people respond to it, and there's an ongoing conversation. Then there are also IRC markets, and IRC markets are based on internet relay chat, which is a slightly older form of instant messaging. But a lot of the same protocols are the same across IRC and forums. People go in, they post an ad, and then there's responses for products and interest in buying and selling. Most of these studies, though, are looking at data retrospectively. So they only get a very small proportion of information, say, from one IRC chat room or from one forum, or maybe in some cases from a small sample of forums, but some of them may have been closed or are no longer active. And so it limits what we necessarily know about the process of data markets. What we have seen generally is evidence that people buy and sell products that are going to generate value. So credit card numbers, bank accounts, there are now services for money laundering or cash outs. So if you want to make money from whatever it is that you buy, but you don't necessarily know how to leverage it, you can go to a third-party vendor who will actually do it on your behalf. So it's creating a sort of cybercrime as service platform. So if you steal data, you may want to buy it, but you don't know what to do with it, so you go to another person in the market who can help you with that. In the end-to-end process, this creates an interesting dynamic whereby it's hard to necessarily know how much people pay for things and what a specific value means. So if my credit card information is sold in the open market for $15, what does that mean to the individual who buys it? Is there a perception that my information is not going to lead to an account with much money in it? Is it a perception that there's 1,000, or if we take the Home Depot numbers as any indication, millions of cards exactly like mine, and so the flood of information on the market arbitrarily reduces price? We don't know. A couple of economists, Hurley and Florencio, made this assertion that nobody pays the price of gold for silver. Basically, you're not going to pay more for something that actually is valued lower. So there may, in fact, be multiple markets operating at any one point in time. Price should dictate how much an individual is going to get for their money. There are going to be lower priced markets where you can go, but your individual risk as an actor is going to be a lot higher. In these markets, generally we know that there are English language groups, and anyone can go in if you're an English language speaker and post an ad or respond to an ad. But there's also ancillary markets operating in various foreign languages, one of the most prevalent being those operating in Cyrillic-based languages. So Russian, individuals in various parts of the former Soviet Union, where there's a lot of data being bought and sold. If we think about language as a barrier to entry, if you're an English language speaker, you're going to go to those forums that you can most easily read. So if we're thinking low-skilled hackers in the US wanting to buy data, where are you going to go to get it? Probably the first English language forum that you can access. And if you see someone selling data for $5 at a pop, why not go to that guy? That vendor may be the person you want to work with. But there's a lot of risk because what you pay $5 for may actually be worthless. You can't use that data. It may be old. There may be a number of different problems with it. There's a secondary market, a better organized one, where prices may be higher, and these could be influenced by language. So if you're a Russian speaker, you can go into those markets, but it's going to arbitrarily reduce the ability for other language sets to access it. And generally, there's evidence to suggest English language forums are cheaper than Russian forums. So one of the potential arguments as to why there are these different pricing structures in place is because of risk. You pay more, you get a better value for your investment. So what we'll spend today talking about is trying to think about how this idea of price, value, and risk influences what actors do. When we think about traditional real-world markets, so say for drugs, stolen goods, even prostitution, there's a supply and a demand that takes place. And there are different risks that individuals take on. So if you're dealing drugs on a street corner, the most immediate risks you're going to face are detection from law enforcement because you're going to stand out, the potential for risk from other dealers or from other actors in the market. What do drug dealers typically have on them at any point in time? Guns? Weapons, money? Somebody else said drugs? So guns, money, and drugs. Those all have value. You can take a weapon and you can use it yourself. Drugs you can resell or use, and money is money. So thinking strategically, A dealer faces a risk from law enforcement because they could be arrested, but they also face risks from other street criminals. You rob a drug dealer, you get an immediate reward. You get cash, you get drugs, and you may get a weapon if they don't get to use theirs in time. So there's this set of formal risks from law enforcement and informal risks as well that emerge from other criminal actors. And the same is true for different types of illicit products, whether we're talking about stolen goods or prostitution. So what we haven't done is consider how these ancillary online markets operate and to what extent they deal with risk in a similar fashion to those in the real world. So that's what we'll try and do today, is pinpoint what are these sources of risk, how do they work, how do people mitigate risk, and to what extent does risk influence the outcome for a reward. So who are the market actors? What do they do? What are the threats to actors? What are the techniques that individuals employ? If we're thinking strategically, we want to understand how bad guys get data, but we also want to know how they use it and what they do with it. So what are the techniques that are used to minimize your risk? If you want to be a successful data broker, who do you sell to? Who's your potential customer? If you're a buyer of data, who do you trust? And then who do you trust to help you get money out of those accounts? And then what are the implications for law enforcement? In a real-world market, we can easily get street-level information from individuals who are buying drugs or who are heavily involved in the scene. And we can troll through an area in a patrol car or get different types of surveillance. This is a little bit harder, though, in a virtual space. We would need to know where the website is to begin with. We would need to be able to develop tactical and strategic information about the group. So we can't necessarily apply the same tactics for market disruption. So the implications of today's talk have value when we're thinking about this from a law enforcement perspective. So let's jump into the data that we used. We collected data from 13 different forums operating in a variety of different places. The far column on the, I'm getting a light here. The far column, you can see the language of the participants. We heavily sampled on Russian language groups because those are the ones that are thought to deal most heavily in stolen data. But we also collected a sample of English language groups as well, thinking that if there's this arbitrary difference in the markets, we can do a direct comparison. We collected a number of threads, and as I mentioned earlier, forums operate through threads. You start a thread by posting a question, or in the case of these markets, creating an advertisement, and then people respond. So we collected a number of different threads from each of these forums. And they were hosted in a variety of different places. Just because the individual participants were speaking in either Russian or English doesn't necessarily mean that's where the site was hosted. We have a few in the US, we have a few in Russia, but many of them are in various parts of Europe, and we even have one in the British Virgin Islands. And the hosting changed repeatedly over time, even though many of these groups are still active and stable. So hosting is perhaps not as pertinent of a measure when we think about participants as is the language of the group. So that's a little bit about our data. Let's jump into the most important points. If you're a data vendor, so you've engaged in a breach or you somehow stumble into a large cache of data from a breach, what do? Well, the first thing that happens in these forums is someone posts an ad. And this is an example of one ad. I realize some of you in the back might not be able to see this, it's a little small, but this is just an example of one ad from one of our forums. The individual comes in and says, I have a fresh base of dumps. And in the context of stolen data markets, a dump is a credit card number or a debit card number and associated information. On the back of your credit card or your debit card, there's tracks. Those magnetic strips hold different data on different tracks. And so the more track data that you have associated with the account, the more value that information may have generally, because you can do more with it. So a dump is like a lot of information. So this guy's selling dumps, and he breaks it out by country. You can see there's US data, Canadian, and European, and Asian. And the US data is surprisingly inexpensive. One piece, so one card or one dump, for a classic or standard Visa or MasterCard is $20. A gold or platinum card is $25, and a business or corporate card is $30. This kind of pricing structure was evident across all of our ads for different products. Why do you think there might be this tiering structure in place? Different limits, exactly. Different balances for different types of accounts. A classic or standard card may have a much lower rotating balance than, say, a business or corporate card. So that could directly influence what you can do with it. Amex is 20 bucks. We occasionally saw vendors specifying whether they had Discover or American Express or what have you. And in thinking about how to advertise it, most of them were pushing lower prices for US data relative to that from Canada and the various parts of Europe and Latin America. One argument is that it may be driven by differential access. Since we keep having these massive breaches in the US, the price may be getting lower because the market is flooded with info. Another issue may be the ability to use the cards. So with European data, you have to have the chip and PIN information if you're going to try to use the card in the store. So that increases potential risk and the value of the account may be raised. Regardless, when you make your ad, you're going to specify how much you're going to pay for what information. And vendors have the ability to dictate all the terms of service. So if I'm selling data, I set for everyone else how you're going to interact with me. This person made their rules very, very clear and said, here's how it works. First, you contact me through one of our supports. Support is an interesting term because all of these guys communicate outside of the forums through ICQ, which is an older form of instant messaging, or email, or occasionally through private messaging systems. And they would specify that they had a customer support line. So if you ever have a problem, contact our support line. So in this case, you contact our support and choose the type of dumps that you want. Calculate the total price and submit your order. Then you send us money and your email. This is an interesting degree of risk when you think about it. If you're a data buyer, you have to send someone you've never met, you've only seen their ad, money. And in some cases, this might be several $1,000s worth of your money. And then, this is on the vendor side, we have 24 hours to complete your order. So you have to wait. And within that time period, we will hopefully get back with you and we'll try to be quick about it. You can see they say a Liberty Reserve payment leads to instant delivery. So they're trying to specify if you use one type of payment system, you'll get a much more rapid response from us. Regardless, that time is quite a gap. If we're thinking about traditional types of illicit markets, you pay for drugs, you get them almost immediately after. With prostitution, there's a negotiation and then service is provided, rendered, and then payment is provided. So dealers and buyers in this market have differential exposures. The one advantage, you might argue, with this type of marketplace is that there are potential avenues for some type of remuneration. In this case, they say we have 24 hours to complete your payment, and then we will actually replace, pick up, or hold call dumps. And what that means is that if an account comes back, if you buy 100 dumps from us, 90 of them work and 10 of them come back as declined or inactive or held, we will actually reissue cards for you. So we replace, pick up, or hold call dumps within 24 hours. So that means you have to run all the cards that you've bought just to make sure whatever you've paid for is working. After that, though, we're not responsible. This type of customer service is something that we saw across various types of products and advertisements. In other words, vendors know there's some degree of risk, so they're trying to find ways to entice clients to work with them. Here's just another example of what I mean. This is an ad for a vendor of PayPal accounts. How many of you have a PayPal account? Okay, many of you, good. With PayPal, this person is saying we have lots of USA and UK data, and they break it out by the type of account that the individual has. So an unverified account with a credit card number. How many of you have an unverified account? How many of you have a verified account? One that's directly linked to your bank account. So this is going to influence how much you're paying. An unverified account isn't linked with any type of specific bank account, just a credit card. So in this case for those, it's one WMZ, which means web money. It's a type of payment system. So one WMZ, which means US. So $1 through web money or $1 in Liberty Reserve for that information. One unverified with a bank account, $1. A verified account with a credit card plus a bank account is $3. Now I realize that's not much when you think about it in the long run. You could do quite a lot with that much information. So for $3, you're getting pretty good value. We also have accounts with email. Just ask us and we'll let you know. We accept web money and Liberty Reserve. And then here are our terms of service, or our rules for service. The seller is not responsible for security measures. So whatever data you buy from us, You have to take responsibility for how it's used. We check all the accounts manually. So in other words, they're only going to sell data that's active. And they give you a clean SOX 5. If you're not familiar with that term, it's a type of proxy. You would want a proxy because, let's just say for the sake of argument, you're an actor living in Germany, you buy these US PayPal accounts, and you start trying to access the accounts from a German IP address. That's going to trigger security and you're not going to be able to use them. So these vendors are giving individuals free proxies that route through the US. So as a buyer, you can rest comfortably knowing I'm going to be able to use this and use it right off the start. But if you unsuccessfully manage the account, you burn the proxy, you have some other issue, the sellers aren't responsible for that. We'll only take you so far, but we're trying to draw you in by saying we offer some degree of customer support. If you have questions, by the way, as I'm going through, feel free to raise your hand. I'm happy to answer anything as it comes up. So, vendors are trying to provide some degree of service, but there's a good degree of risk that the buyers take on. We've covered data as it's being sold. Here's a final point of interest. This is an individual offering cash out services. And what they do basically is work with any type of data that you buy. You can work with a cash out service to put money into different accounts. You can see they transmit electronic funds, they'll divert funds, they'll work with accounts that have been seized by authorities, and we work with dirty funds. So however you get money, we're happy to work with you. Our advantage, low commission, so they don't take much of the money, and speed. As a rule, funds that are received on the day that they're credited to our company's account go right into yours within 1 day maximum after the credit. So you get money quickly. These are all ways to potentially draw in customers by saying, we're doing our best to help you. Just to give you a sense of the distribution of products in our data set, these are the range of resources that we saw being sold. The most prevalent were dumps with 5,000 different records, and then CVVs. And if you're not familiar, CVVs are the credit verification value, the 3 or 4 digit number on the back of your card. You need that if you're making a purchase over the phone or online to guarantee that you have that card in your hand. So buying a CVV nets you some potentially usable data right off the start. But there are some real dramatic differences in price. Just focusing on dumps for a minute, the minimum price that we saw went from 4 cents to 8,000, with 8,000 being a pretty dramatic outlier. But the average price was $102. So if we factor in all the various countries and different products that may be involved, you're looking at around $102 to buy a dump. And for eBay and PayPal accounts, there's some similar variation, but the average winds up being about $27. So on the whole, there's not a heavy investment of individual money in order to buy data. When you think about how much money you might have in your bank account or what your credit card balance is, if you're paying $100 and your account limit is $15,000 and they might have $4,000 or $5,000 to play with, that's a pretty good return on your initial investment. So from a buyer's point of view, it's worthwhile to try to get into this market if you think you know what you're doing. If you think you know what you're doing, because you could generate a lot of money. And we see individuals offering various services to help along with that, whether it's dedicated servers in case you want to set up your own shop and run cards for $10 or $15 at a time. Some people offer cash out services, as I mentioned. We see some people offering what are called drops services. And drop services are where, say, you buy 15 Xbox Ones online or a bunch of PS4s. You could have them shipped to an address and have someone there to pick it up on your behalf. If you've ever had anything FedExed or sent via UPS, sometimes you have to sign for your packages. Well, drops providers will find abandoned homes, vacant lots, any type of resource where packages can be left. The person who picks up the resource will then either pawn it, they'll fence it, or they'll forward it on to whatever address you specify. So a drop service gives you a mechanism for making a lot of hops between whatever product you have shipped and your final destination. So it's a worthwhile way to minimize your own risk in using data. But getting to this point of risk, as I mentioned earlier, there are these multiple markets that may be operating based on price and based on language. There's a heavy threat to buyers in these markets, and that's the risk of being ripped off. So if you're buying data from someone, as was mentioned in that first example for dumps, if the vendor has 24 hours to get back with you, That's a long time to wait. And so you may give them 24 hours. And at the end of it, you say, where are my dumps? Oh, we need another 24 hours. Just wait. Be patient. And then they never send anything. Some vendors will deliberately never send any data. Some vendors will deliberately send junk data. Nothing works. And as a consequence, the buyer has no avenue for recourse. They can't get their money back. All they can do is try to find another service that offers a reasonable product. So when a buyer gets ripped off, there's a great deal of money that they may be out. We have this sample of 13 forums, and when we exclude 2 of our boards based on complaints of being ripped off, it actually changes the picture of what's the most common products sold. If we take all of them at once, dumps are the most common, followed by CVVs. But if we exclude our rip-off forums, the ones that have a lot of complaints, CVVs fall out completely. It's a disreputable product, at least in certain types of markets, because there's too much risk associated with them. You're not going to get what you paid for. And certain other products come up to replace them. So like eBay and PayPal accounts come up from below the top 10 when we exclude 2 different boards. So, yes, ma'am. Oh, plastics. Good question. If you've stayed in a hotel, you get a card that has your room data on it. Plastics are what we might refer to as sort of hotel room keys. They're just blank plastic cards that have nothing on the magnetic strip. So some guys will offer plastics as a mechanism to take the dump data that you buy and print it onto physical cards that you can then go and use at a store or at a gas station or wherever. There's a pretty exponentially high rate of risk, though, if you're taking dump data and then you're going to Walmart or a gas station and you're making purchases, because you may show up on a camera or there's a way to directly associate someone with the use of that account. So to use plastics, well, it raises some of your individual risk, but it certainly is something that some people offer. Other products meaning across the board here? Oh, the other products category. Gotcha. Other products in this case were things that we couldn't necessarily classify into one specific category. So in some cases, we have things like individuals offering Steam accounts. If you're familiar with Steam, it's a type of online gaming. So stuff that doesn't fall neatly into a specific type of, say, a financial product, but it is something that can be misused. This also does include, to a certain extent, things like jailbroken iPhones or Android devices. So it's a catch-all for things that we couldn't neatly put in any other box. So a lot of different products, but it's affected by risk. As I mentioned, we tried to separate them by different terms. If we base it on language, our English language boards were our ripping boards, the ones where there were lots of people being cheated. So we in fact find some support for this idea that language may arbitrarily impact risk. The good markets, for whatever reason in our data set, are the ones that are communicating in Russian, because the risk of loss is much lower. If you go to an English language board, there's a high likelihood, especially if you're buying CVVs, that whatever money you pay is not going to be returned to you. And this has some interesting impacts overall when we think about market dynamics. We tried to separate our data into different categories by country. So some people specifically stated, I have dumps from the US, I have dumps from Canada. And so we took the log price, trying to control for all the variation that we see, and compared by country. With bank accounts, for instance, you can see the price in column that's marked 1 is the price for that country compared to everything else. So in the first line, Asian dumps are, or pardon me, Asian bank accounts are 448 relative to all other countries, which are 482. So there's a difference in the price based on region. And the little dashes indicate that there is a statistically significant difference. So when we look at, say, bank account data, European data is much cheaper relative to all other countries. When we compare for dumps, we see that the US data is very cheap, so it's $3.04 relative to $3.85 in all other countries. The UK is the lowest, though, at $2.81 relative to $3.69 for all other nations. So there is some pricing differential based on place, at least based on these specific products. But I mentioned this idea of risk, being ripped off or otherwise cheated. If that happens, one of the only mechanisms that buyers have in order to get any sense of support or to get anything back from their experience, is to try to make a complaint. But the only way that you can make a complaint is by going through the process. So everybody requires that you pay in advance for whatever it is that you've gotten. One of the few mechanisms that exist in order to provide some degree of support for both buyer and seller are escrow payment systems. Escrow payments are an unusual mechanism whereby, and this is an example of it, if you want to buy from someone, you can work with a guarantor or an escrow agent who will hold money on your behalf until such time as the vendor releases whatever it is that you've paid for. So this first one, the guarantor of a forum's been created so you'll not be deceived. By conducting a transaction through a guarantor, you can be sure that you're satisfied. Terms for working with the guarantor. Buyer and seller reach an agreement. They contact the guarantor through ICQ. One of the parties gives money to the guarantor and the other goods. And then each side gets what they demand. Yes? That's a good question. So if this is all illegal anyway, how do we know that a guarantor is not going to rip you off? The argument is that a guarantor is an established and reputable person within the forum. And in our sample, only those well-organized, well-functioning forums had guarantor services. So you have a reasonable degree of trust that the guarantor is going to purely serve as a middleman, and that's all. And in one of the forums in this example, the individual took a proportion of the total. So you were paying this gentleman for the privilege of using his services. And that, again, provides some degree of insularity. They're not going to run with the data if, as you can see here, if you make a payment of over $3,000, they get 5% of the total. So there's enough incentive for the guarantor to not run. There's enough incentive for the buyer and the seller to go along with this as well. But this is a way to minimize risk that the buyer takes on. So they have to pay that 5% difference. That doesn't affect the seller in any way. So guarantor services are one way to manage risk. Another way to minimize your likelihood of loss, since all these communications take place outside of the forum, is the use of customer feedback. If you've bought anything on eBay or Amazon, you know that you can read the reviews about that provider and know if that person is in fact reputable. The same is true within these markets. When you go through the process of buying, you can go back into the board and say this guy was exactly what he claimed to be, his products were good, or that's when you can say this person ripped me off, I can't believe they took my money and didn't send me anything. So in this instance, this is an example of positive feedback for a person who was a money launderer. You can see they say, I laundered $300, the speed was comparable to the second cosmic speed, in other words, this is really fast, everything was magnificent, I'll go back. The second one, I did some laundering of money from a female partner, everything was quick and excellent, and the thread starter takes a small percentage, which makes you happy. So, positive feedback equals potentially good customer feedback overall. That's an excellent point. So if the use of feedback is a potential weakness in this market, we could exploit it by spoofing other actors and posting fake feedback, or we could directly rip off people's comments and throw them into our own thread. It's an argument that some computer security researchers have suggested we actually begin to use, referred to as a Sybil attack or a slander attack, where we start posting negative feedback or just junking up threads with all kinds of commentary. We'll get to that idea in just a moment as to whether or not that might be effective. Generally, it seems like it may have limited value for only certain types of markets, because when a forum gets a lot of comments regarding ripping, if it's consistent, if people are constantly complaining about a ripper, in an English language forum, the general comment becomes, well, you shouldn't pay money to that person. That's your own fault. In our better organized forums, negative feedback had some definitive consequences for the seller. This is just an example of rip-off complaints, of a bad set of positive reviews. This first guy says, has your service been tested or vouched? Some of our better forums actually offered testing services as a means of knowing what you were paying for and as a way to sort of increase a seller's reputation. I can provide potential business for you if you get tested. The next person says he's a ripper. I don't believe him. He says his drops are from Florida. The seller says, I'm not a ripper. I've never had a complaint. This poster just wants to cause trouble. I've never dealt with him before. There's no logs to back up his claim. Moderator, please ban him. And then the next person says, I contacted him on another forum. I asked him if he accepts escrow for guarantees. Of course, he refused. That's a potential marker that this guy is going to rip you off because he's not willing to work through an existing channel to minimize risk. The idea that we could exploit this system is an important one, but one of the best mechanisms that these actors have in order to minimize the risk of loss. If feedback is one way that you know who can you trust. There's a third set of systems in place at the moderator level. Better forums will actually go through a review process. So they will specifically check or test goods. This is done in 4 of our forums in our sample, and they were all Russian language groups. This is just an example of one process of checking. You can see checking goods takes place voluntarily, or if the administration of the forum demands it or requires it. Checking of goods is done by one person, been designated by the forum, and you can read more about that individual. The check lasts from 1 to 3 days. After the check, the moderator guarantees that there will not be any stupid flames in the topic and that the quality of goods will not be discussed. The moderator writes a review and then closes the topic. So if you get tested and everything checks out, the service is basically going to go through and manage your thread for you. Nobody else gets to make negative feedback or any kind of commentary that might hurt you. If a requirement to provide your product for testing is refused, you risk being banned and your announcement erased. We don't take any money for testing. You provide the product for the test in the same configuration as which you sell it. So, if you don't go through our process, we can ban you. If you do, there are some advantages. Question? It's a good question. Who's operating these sites in the first place? Some of the boards in our sample appear to be operated by individuals who have a long-standing reputation in the hacker community. Others just appear to be operated by people who were interested in this in the first place. We don't see a lot of direct information as to how much money they're generating by hosting the space, but some of the better ones offered sales of banner ads. So if you wanted to have an ad posted, it cost you $5 a month. So they may generate some small revenue through that mechanism, or some individuals taking money through guarantors. You, sir, in the back, and then we'll come back to you. All of our forums are web-based. They are not Tor-based. So these are different from, say, like Silk Road type sites or Onion-based sites. So yes, they can be tracked. We've started to look at some of those types of forums just to see how similar or how different they are, because that's a good point. We can track these a little bit better than some of the other ones. Go ahead. Generally speaking, we don't see much risk at all because they appear to be removed somewhat from the individual experiences. Instead, most of the emphasis, at least from what we can tell working with law enforcement and other groups, it's either the vendor or the buyer who's going to face legal trouble. There's not much that we've seen with regard to attempts to take out hosting sites, and even the fact that you can buy cracked hosting services means these sites can sort of rotate and move as they see fit. So there appears to be minimal risk to the moderators, or the testers, or the checkers. It's more for the individual market actors. So if that's one mechanism that can be used to further mitigate risk for buyer and seller, there's a final set of processes, and that relates to this use of feedback. If there's potential for us to exploit the review process, better forums are actually going to have built-in systems to minimize their risk of external penetration through the use of administrative oversight. The better operated Russian boards on our site specifically provided terms and rules for participating in any given thread. This is just an example of one of them. It's against the forum rules for you to leave fictitious topics or fictitious posts. So if you come into a thread and say, oh, this guy ripped me off, I bought X number of dumps from him, you actually have to provide some degree of verification that you bought from that person. They say the fact that a transaction's been carried out must be confirmed by proof upon first request from the administration. So that might be a chat log, that might be a direct transfer, or your payment. If this clause is violated, the user leaving a fictitious review will be banned, perhaps even permanently. It's against the forum rules to leave the following type of message. Thread starter is a burner or a ripoff artist. You shouldn't have anything to do with him. We will immediately post logs providing guilt if you have them. And then this final point, reviews from users with 1 to 10 messages who have not been on the forum for long will be deleted at the discretion of the moderator. So if you're a competing vendor and you start posting fictitious reviews against your competition, the moderators can go in, and the better ones are actually going to police these types of posts, and they'll delete those fictitious ones. They may even ban those user accounts. They may check to see where the logins took place and actually ban the individual IP address associated with this. So there are ways for forums to directly manage who's trying to engage in the sites. A slander attack or something where you're specifically exploiting the review process may work, but it's only going to hit those ones that are poorly managed, poorly moderated. The ones that are better organized are going to be able to insulate themselves from external attack like that. So slander attacks, these Sybil attacks, can only go so far. But if there's ways to determine who's a good vendor and who's a bad one, this has some direct impact on what we might think of as the scope of harm for participating in these markets. So we know about data breaches, we know they happen. How much money do people stand to earn from the sale of information? This is an attempt on our part to try to estimate how many transactions take place. Since we can't see it, since all the actual transactions take place outside of the forum, we've tried to come up with a way to estimate it based off of feedback. So how many negative feedback instances could we observe? How many positive could we observe? Of course, this introduces the potential that we've captured some false positives and some false negatives, but this is at least one way to try to estimate how many transactions may have occurred. And if we separate it by ripping and non-ripping, this has specific value because we know how many transactions a ripper may have engaged in relative to a legitimate seller. Dumps, being the most prevalent product sold in our markets, also had the greatest number of feedback instances provided. So we have 257 instances of feedback surrounding dumps. 190 of those were from our non-ripping boards. Only 67 of those were from our ripping forums. So a much smaller proportion of feedback generally in our ripping boards, and even then, it's not necessarily an overwhelming amount. What we try to do from there is to take the average price paid for information. So let's just stick with the dumps, for example. If the average for dumps is $102.60, most sellers specifically indicated they had to buy information in lots. So I require that you buy at least 50 of my dumps or you have to spend $300. So there are at least some basic rules in place for engaging in the market space. The average being about 100 dumps per purchase. So if we take 100 dumps at $102 average, that means if a person's buying 100 dumps, they're spending $10,000. That's a pretty good chunk of money right off the bat. Now again, this is an estimate. It's not a perfect kind of guideline, but it is at least a starting point. There's few, if any, economic estimates of the total scope of a marketplace. So this is fraught with potential concerns, but it is at least some way forward. If we take the eBay and PayPal example, just for instance, if it's $27 average price, most people are requesting you buy at least 50. So in that case, 50 eBay or PayPal accounts at $27.25 a piece leads to a $1,300 investment. So if we take the total number of transactions from ripping and non-ripping forums, and we take the average price, for dumps, that means we're looking at $2.6 million worth of money moving. Does that sound like a lot of money to you? It's not as much as, say, drug markets, but it's a healthy amount of money. For eBay and PayPal, we're looking at about $11,000, which relative to the damage that you could do with an eBay or PayPal account is quite different. So we're seeing some variable pricing. If we take everything as it stands, the entire scope of our market is somewhere in the neighborhood of $3 million. So across 13 forums, across all the transactions and all the products, we look at about $3 million worth of product being moved. That's how much sellers were making at least. The real challenge comes in when we think about buyer profits. So if sellers get their money, whether or not they send data, whether or not any of it works, buyers are the ones who take all the risk. So if you're investing $10,000 of your money and none of it works, that's a lot of money to just throw out the window. For buyers, you can see non-ripping positive feedback was 117 instances. In our ripping forums, we had 24 instances of feedback. So 141 instances total of feedback regarding dumps for buyers. This raises some concerns, though, because we know how much they paid for the data. What we don't know is how much money they actually get out of an account. There's really no way to know this. There's not any statistical information as of yet that we can gather from official sources like, say, the FBI or the Secret Service or other federal law enforcement agencies. We could use information from groups like, say, the Ponemon Institute that does studies on data breaches, but if we're trying to think of a direct impact to consumers, we haven't found any source yet that specifically indicates how much a person loses due to identity theft from high-tech crime only. The source that we've tried to use here is information collected by the Bureau of Justice Statistics. They did a survey in 2012 of victims of identity theft, but they don't specify whether that's high-tech or low-tech. So it could be that somebody got your credit card or your driver's license in the physical space, or it could be online. Regardless, there's a lot of variation there. If we're talking about direct funds acquired by identity thieves, with credit cards, it was $1,400. That's the average loss to a consumer. The median is $300. For debit cards, it's $552, but the median is $200. So there are some real differences here. And that has a substantial impact on what we think about in terms of return on investment for a buyer. Just to give you an example, if we think about this from a return on investment standpoint, if you spend $10,000, how much are you going to get after the fact? If we take positive feedback from dumps, if we assume that 65 cards are valid, again, we have no way of knowing if these 117 instances of feedback are absolute. And let's just say, for the sake of argument, just a little bit more than half of the cards work. Then the return on investment is tremendously variable. If we take the average credit card loss from the Bureau of Justice Statistics data, you're looking at $94,000 total that a buyer of stolen data may generate using dumps. If we take the median, then we're looking at $19,000. So there's a dramatic difference there, just based on which estimate we use. If we take the median loss, which is the lower amount, then buyers could stand to gain $2.2 million based on buying data across all the forums in our sample based on dumps. That's not a bad rate of investment if we're thinking about buying data. From a buyer point of view, you don't take any of the risk in terms of the breach. You're just paying somebody else for the service. The legal risks are pretty substantial, but at least your potential gain is huge. You've got an 8.17 return on investment, depending on which metric we use. If we take the debit card values, then things are dramatically different. With debit cards, you're only making about $35,000 or $13,000, depending on which estimate to use. If we take the median, we're looking at about $1.5 million. Again, it's not bad, but there's a lot of risk involved. If we take the eBay and PayPal value, the return on investment is much, much greater. But we only had one instance of positive feedback overall. That means out of all 13 of our forums, only one guy said the data that I bought worked, and this guy is a good vendor. So in that respect, we don't necessarily know that this is a great product, but it is an improvement over dumps. If you think about it, you pay $1,300. If you take the average amount for credit card losses, you're looking at $36,000. If you take the median, it's $7,500. With debit cards, it's a little lower, as I mentioned earlier. But the rate of return is a lot better, at least with eBay and PayPal accounts, if this information is accurate. Are there any questions about this part? So, in general, we've tried to think about this data in a couple of different frameworks. If we take everything that's here, we do find support for that initial hypothesis I talked about at the start of the talk. There appear to be two different types of markets operating. One that is based on mistrust. There's a lot of potential for risk for the buyer and not so much for the seller. But there's another better organized set of markets that's operating where there's insularity and risk is much, much lower for buyers. And there's better organization on the part of the forum operators to manage individual risk. And in general, there's much, much greater risk within these markets from other individual participants than there is from any type of external law enforcement source. With a drug market or a prostitution market, you can take out one group or another and make some kind of long-term difference. In these markets, if you consider just the sheer number of transactions that we could observe and the number of vendors, There's someone who can easily replace a dump spender. There's someone who can easily jump in and organize themselves in a way that's much more insulated from outsiders than others. The fact that there are guarantor services is tremendously different than what we see with real-world types of crime. Intermediaries who are there to minimize risk are less prevalent in certain forms of real-world markets. And so overall, we find support for this idea of two different markets. There are organized ones and disorganized ones. The organized ones have slightly higher prices for data, but there are better systems in place. You know what you're getting when you pay that money. In fact, this goes to an idea of lemon markets. I don't know if you're familiar with this idea of lemon markets, but if you buy a bad car and you pay $1,000 for it, and it breaks as soon as you drive it out the lot, that's a much different set of circumstances than if you pay, $15,000 for a new car, and you have some warranty and some degree of guarantees that the car is going to work. So there's variation in what is available. The presence of electronic payment systems also helps out when we think about this market. Different payment systems minimize different types of risk. The availability of replacements, the fact that there are ripping markets with lower prices, all makes a difference too. Yes, sir. The guarantors will run checks or tests. So for instance, they might run the bin list for a set of dumps and see, does this actually correspond to existing banks? And then they may run small checks or tests, say for like $1 or $2. So they'll run very, very small checks to see, can I engage in a transaction with this data? And they may do it with a very small sample, just to ensure, yes, this product works. Yes, sir. In our data set, we did not see virtual currencies, but that's largely a function of when our data was collected. We wound up ending around 2011 with the most recent data point. So Bitcoin hadn't penetrated this particular set of markets yet. In looking at some of the Tor-based markets for data, they are using various types of cryptocurrencies. But still within these types of web-based forums, most participants are taking some type of some type of electronic payment system that corresponds to a real-world currency. So whether that is web money or Yandex, or there are a few Russian groups that are emerging to sort of fill this space. So not so much with cryptocurrency, but that could change in the next couple of years. Yes, sir. We initially discovered the forums through known data points. We had been in some of these forums already. We ran a Google search, and our first couple of boards turned up in those Google searches, and so we read through the posts and started finding additional sources. So we engaged in what you might refer to as, in traditional qualitative research, a snowball sample. So you get one person to talk to you and say, who are your friends? Would they talk to you? So we used a similar model here. We found pages via Google, read through them, clicked through links to find other forums that may or may not be indexed by Google, and create a network of groups that way. Yes, sir. Oh, okay, so the question is, have we tried to simulate either the behavior of market participants or the data itself? We have not been able to simulate data. So for instance, selling our own type of credit cards or seeing how long it might take for information to flow back to a bank. There's a lot of ethical risks that come up when you try to do that type of work, so it's a little harder to get into that. We have done some virtual and simulated network building to see how do these networks of actors look in forums relative to what we might expect their simulated networks to look like, and they are dramatically different. But no, we haven't done anything with the data itself yet. Yes, sir. Yes, we are aware that that happens. We did not really get any chance to verify that within our data because we can't pay for information. So certainly it could be present in this. It might be that one card is circulated multiple times, but we couldn't actually observe that here. Any other questions? Well, I'll go ahead and jump to sort of the key point in all of this, and it actually tees up quite nicely. In thinking about these markets, one of the biggest challenges that has emerged from a research standpoint is a transition from web-based forums to either Tor or Onion-based groups, and Many of the groups that we've observed have gone from being registration-based, so you create a username and a password and you can access the forum. Some of them have gone to paid access only or vetted access, so the only way that you get into the forum is by having one or two known actors verify your identity and say you're an okay person. So the market is beginning to constrain itself in such a way as to be difficult for outsiders to access. As a consequence, this raises some ethical issues for us as researchers. If we have to pay $50 to get access to a forum, or we can only be brought in if we know two people who are already engaged, how do we find those people? Or alternatively, how do we get inroads into closed markets to see what is actually going on? And if we do that, how do we minimize our footprint and reduce the risk for law enforcement partners and otherwise to really do an effective job of research? Those are going to be the types of markets that we really want to understand, because if what we see are ripping groups and non-ripping groups that comprise a second, that third market is really the one that we want to understand, the ones that are the most closed off, the ones that are the most insulated, and perhaps have the most valid representation of what's going on. With the Home Depot breach, you might know that that story was leaked by Brian Krebs by being in some of the deep underground forums. That's where you can see the most cutting-edge data being sold, but that has some potential ethical and legal risks from a university researcher perspective. So we need to find ways to partner up with outside agencies, with industry and other partners to do this research effectively. And in turn, we might be able to really understand what is going on. Otherwise, the existing body of academic research is based off of a sort of superfluous level of data transactions. The other valuable thing would be to see the offline or off-forum transactions that take place. We're speculating about the total number of transactions that occurred, when in reality it may be much higher or much lower. The only way that we would know that is by getting ICQ logs and concrete data from these sources. And there's only one real way to get it, and that's by trying to engage directly with the seller. So there are some new ways that we're going to have to think about doing research in order to more effectively get into these markets. And part of that is going to be through good partnerships with law enforcement. So that's where we're going to need to go in the future. In general, we have a lot of other things that we're doing with this data. If you're interested in what I've talked about today, we actually have a nearly 200-page report that's available online through the National Institute of Justice, kind of going through our findings in depth and getting into some nooks and crannies of research. And if you're interested, feel free to shoot me an email or get in touch with me. I can send you whatever materials we have. Are there any other questions? Yes, sir. We have data going back from 2007 to 2011, so an inclusive period of about 5 years. When we started the project in 2010, we could only get so much data at once. Since I'm not a native Russian speaker, there were concerns about the accuracy of translations. Certainly, if you've ever used Google Translate, you know the results are okay, depending on what language set we're looking at. So there was a heavy emphasis from our funding agency on making sure that what we were looking at was a direct Russian to English translation that we could rely on. So we wound up having to stop data collection and then pass information to a translator and then start working with that. So it limited what we could get at any point in time. Yes, we've been in markets still. We're looking in different places. Since we're not working with that translator at the moment, a lot of it is based off of quick gisting from Russian speakers. So it's not perhaps to the depth that we've gotten here. But yes, we are still heavily engaged in a variety of markets. And this is just one aspect of our research. We look at malicious software markets. We look at the data markets. We're even getting a little bit into firearms and illicit document markets online. Any other questions? Well, thank you all for coming. I appreciate it. Hopefully this was interesting for you. Thank you.